Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello, welcome to a new episode of the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Archishman Chaudhuri, and my guest today is Dr. Mikko Toivanen, a postdoctoral researcher at Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. Dr. Mikko Toivanen studied history at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where he researched and wrote for his research master's thesis, which was published as a monograph by the Leiden University Press entitled The Travels of Peter Albert Bick, Writings from the Dutch Colonial World of the Early 19th Century. Dr. Mikko Toivanen developed his research into 19th century Dutch and British colonial travelogues as his doctoral research at the European University of Institute Florence, where he defended his doctoral thesis entitled Colonial Tours, the Leisure and Anxiety of Empire in Travel Writing from Java, Ceylon, and the Strait Settlements, 1840 to 1875. At present, Dr. Mikko Toivanen is working on a postdoctoral project called Staging a Colonial Capital, the Construction of Public Space in Singapore and Batavia through Spectacle and Ceremony, 1845 to 1870. Today, we will hear Dr. Mikko Toivanen talk about his research on colonial tourism and its relationship with environment in Ceylon, in Java, and in the Strait Settlements in the 19th century. He will discuss with us how British and Dutch colonialism in the 19th century interacted with the environment. Without much further ado, Dr. Mikko Toivanen, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
I would just like to start with a very basic question. What triggered your interest in studying colonial travelogues? And from the perspective of understanding these travelogues as sources that speak of human-environment interaction, is there any way that you can tell us how these travelogues sort of describe or explore colonial developments over a long term in the 19th century?
So thank you very much for that question. So like you already mentioned in your introduction, which was very thorough, so I already started working on colonial travel during my master's studies in Leiden in the Netherlands. So this has been going on for quite a long time. And I think there is something about travelogues, about travel writing as a source that is just kind of inherently fascinating, because it's a kind of a very quick way to get a kind of an overview of everything that's happening in a region or in the empire. So of course, we're talking here strictly from an imperial perspective, but to get a kind of a good overview of all the sort of topics of interest in imperial discourse in a period, in my case, the sort of the middle of the 19th century. So there is that kind of fascination of just kind of seeing all these different topics and how different there is this fascination of just seeing all of these different topics and how people think about them at the time. Now, in terms of the environment aspect specifically, of course, the natural environment is extremely important for all kinds of travel, but especially for the sort of tourism that I'm interested in, kind of early colonial tourism. And many of the sites that people visit or see are kind of points of interest because of the natural environment. So, firstly, in the kind of most obvious, clear sense, the natural environment itself is a destination. So people go to see volcanoes on Java, people go to see waterfalls, people go hiking in the mountains in various places. So the nature itself is a destination, as it is in Europe at this time as well. But then secondly, colonial travelogues give you a very clear kind of idea of how colonization transforms the natural environment. So this is the 19th century is a period of colonial expansion and colonial consolidation in much of the region of Southeast Asia and Ceylon that I'm interested in. You can see new plantations forming, how they kind of take space from, I was going to say wild nature, but obviously that's quite a loaded term, but sort of nature that hasn't been colonized in that sense. They become productive agricultural land. So that's one thing you see. And then thirdly, I think an interesting thing with plantations in particular is that they become sort of tourist sites and destinations in their own right. So we don't really think of kind of farms as tourist sites in the present day. Actually, maybe we do nowadays with kind of agriturismo in Italy and so on. But already in the 19th century, people were very interested in seeing how new plantations work, what sort of machinery they use, what's kind of the organization of labor. So there's very much this in 19th century tourism in Europe also, but also in the colonial realm. There was very much this interest, this fascination with kind of new technology and how it's shaping the nature. So that becomes a part of the tourist discourse. So I mean, that's just kind of a slightly rambly answer, but I hope maybe that kind of gets us to a start with this topic.
Well, it does indeed. Thank you. As I've been reading some of your research, I came across this point you make, drawing upon from Richard Grove's work on environmentalism in the British Empire. And you sort of argued that the reason why the British and also the Dutch colonial tours were so interested in the Eastern Islands in the Indian Ocean is they feel a disconnect between the industrialized societies back home in Great Britain or in the Netherlands and the sort of rustic, untampered nature that they encounter in places like Ceylon, Java, and also, I guess, further in the Indonesian archipelago. I felt this is a strong note of emotional disconnect that the early colonial tourists encountered. But it's also a product of colonial redesigning, which you argue led to the construction of botanical gardens. For instance, the Buitenzorg in Java, or the gardens of Peradeniya in Ceylon, and the gardens in Singapore. But as much as I understand that there is a strong tendency on the part of emperors or conquerors to redesign landscapes according to their whims or what they expect or what they would like it to be. For instance, I'm reminded of the Mughal Emperor Babur, who, after moving to South Asia from Central Asia in the 16th century, he redesigns the landscape according to the Charbagh gardens, which are now so typical of the Mughal style. And this is a style that he borrows from Central Asia. And then you point out that the colonial botanical gardens also draw upon inspirations from Europe, and they are by no means sort of this paradise-like Edens, which they are described, of course, in the travelogues. But I felt that in this case, environment, it becomes a performance by the colonial authorities. It's not just redesigning, it's a site of performance. And even the travelogues that make or speak of the tours to these botanical gardens sort of also become a performance of living up to the colonial realities. What is your take on that?
I think that's an absolutely fascinating point, and I think I really like how you raise the example of kind of other rulers before European colonization using gardens as a kind of a site of imperial prestige in a way. And I think this is something that is quite often maybe forgotten when we talk about botanical gardens in the 19th century, which we see as kind of sites of 19th century science, European kind of scientific worldviews. But there is this much kind of longer history of gardens and basically kind of as a symbol of power, which the botanical gardens are also drawing upon very much. I just kind of like to go back a little bit. You mentioned Richard Grove's work on how kind of tropical islands came to be seen in the European imagination, in the imperial imagination, as this kind of paradise-like some kind of gardens of Eden. And this is very much a discourse that you see in 19th century travelogues. Ceylon is frequently referred to as the Eden of the Eastern Wave, but similar language also is used for Java, for Singapore, and other places in the region. What I find really interesting about this metaphor of the Garden of Eden is that it has a kind of a double meaning. At the same time, it implies this kind of untouched wilderness, which you also mentioned. But at the same time, it is a garden, so it also implies cultivated land, productive land, agricultural land. And I think this kind of double meaning is this kind of elision of meanings is used quite consciously by travel writers in the 19th century, where they often talk about the environment of these islands as being paradise-like and untouched. But then when they actually describe it, they're not actually describing untouched land. They are precisely describing these botanical gardens. They are describing plantations, which are productive agricultural land. So there is this kind of transformation of the meaning of what a Garden of Eden is, as you can kind of use that metaphor to make precisely this case. You can use that metaphor to make precisely this case of making the environment work for the empire, leaving a kind of an imperial stamp on the environment as it becomes productive. So I think I absolutely take your point that botanical gardens in particular, they are a performance, a kind of a performance of the empire's relationship with the environment. There is definitely a kind of a element of competitive botany, if you will, competitive garden building in the 19th century, where Dutch travelers would go to Singapore and they'd say, well, this is a nice garden, but actually we have a better one in Buitenzorg. Especially kind of earlier on in the period that I'm interested in, British travelers would go to Buitenzorg and they would say, oh, actually, this is really nice. Maybe we should have something like this. So there is this kind of comparative kind of this competition really between these different imperial powers, these two major imperial powers. What I would also like to point out about botanical gardens is that they are usually, there's a lot of very good work on botanical gardens in the 19th century, but they are quite often understood primarily as sites of science, like I said just there. In my work, what comes across in these travelogues most kind of forcefully is that they are also sites of leisure and sites of entertainment for travelers, but also for the kind of the elite local colonial society. So people go there for walks, just kind of for the pleasure of a walk, but they also go there for concerts. There's a lot of social life, especially in Singapore. You have kind of events organized in these gardens. So they are kind of central locations for social life and leisure as well. And I think this is something to remember. They become a kind of a easier replacement for the supposedly untouched wilderness of the colonies, because they are a controlled environment. There's protection from kind of excessive heat or from insects or from diseases, which are things that the colonial environment, the tropical environment is frequently associated with. In the botanical garden, you can, in a way, experience the good sides of the tropical environment without the bad sides. That's the idea that is kind of promoted in this sort of travel writing that I'm interested in. So these gardens also become a kind of a safe location for social life, also partly because quite often they have exclusive access. Sometimes you have to be white to get in. Sometimes you have to be of an elite status to get in. It depends in different places and different times, but it's always restricted who gets to actually be a part of this social life in the gardens. And they are made to be a kind of a showpiece of imperial culture, partly imported from Europe. What always amuses me is this fact that I found in a document on the Peradeniya Gardens in Ceylon, where they imported park benches all the way from Britain just to kind of create the right sort of environment, the right sort of look for a garden, which clearly you could have just built there, but it was kind of an important part of the look. So, this sort of idea of botanical garden as a kind of a representation of tropical environment that can be used as a stage for a certain kind of social life. That's what I'm interested in.
Thank you. I'm just going to stay on a bit longer with the botanical gardens. And might I just ask you another question on this? You've spoken of the trans-imperial networks of these travelers, particularly the Dutch and the British, that there is always, some sort of correspondence. For example, you pointed out the case of the Dutch botanist, W.H. de Vries, who went to Ceylon to understand coffee cultivation and sort of to figure out if there were ways to replicate that in the Dutch East Indies. But what intrigued me was, do these travelers who are connected to each other in sort of a trans-imperial network also speak to each other about the environment through their travelogues? I mean, is there a question of emulation involved? I mean, were there any trend-setting works that describe the flora and fauna as a colonial travelogue, which was sort of emulated by later travelers? And if that was the case, in sort of this process of emulating descriptions or sort of painting the same painting picture about the same place, but from a different time scale, does this process allow us in any measure a glimpse into changing colonial realities in the 19th century?
Yeah, so it's a very good question and kind of very big question. I'll just start with the transcolonial aspect there, which I think is very important. So a big part of my research, kind of one of the major arguments that I make in my research, is that that there was this rather developed circuit of transcolonial travel, leisure travel in particular, around the middle of the 19th century that encompassed Southeast Asia and kind of the region around the Bay of Bengal. So the point that I'm making is that this kind of early colonial tourism was not national or restricted to a single colony, but it was transcolonial in nature. Now, you mentioned transcolonial scientific collaborations, trans-imperial scientific networks, and this is of course a topic that quite a lot of work has been done and is currently being done by people who are kind of much better placed to talk about it than I am, because my interest is primarily in tourism. But if we kind of shift a little bit away from the scientific aspect into the touristic aspect, the leisure aspect of travel. So what I'm interested in is there are British colonial officials in India, for example, stationed in India, who then travel to the Dutch East Indies. Or there's a lot of Dutch colonial officials who, when they are going back to Europe, are either at the end of their careers or for a stay. They travel through Singapore, maybe Ceylon, maybe India. They see these places as they travel through the region. So there's this kind of creation of a regional colonial culture of travel. And indeed, precisely like you said, that leads to the emergence of a kind of a regional frame of reference, also for how people think about the natural environment. So a big part of this kind of travel is what is called invalid travel. So people who go to places with supposedly more healthy climates to convalesce for a period. And there's a lot of works published about this sort of travel that give you advice on where you should go. So for example, you see a kind of an emergence of a hierarchy of places with the best climates for a European colonial official. So for example, if you lived in Bengal and you wanted to go somewhere healthier, then you could go to Singapore, which is better. But if you have more money, you should go to Java, because that's even better. And on Java, you can go to Buitenzorg, which is obviously the main kind of travel destination on the island. But actually, if you have a bit more money and are a bit more adventurous, you should go to Bandung, which is not that far away, but has much better climate for a European constitution. So you can see this kind of very detailed hierarchy of places, of kind of which destinations are better than others, what kind of climates are better than others. And it's being created on a regional scale. So there is this idea that if you are a colonial official in Bengal, you get to choose between all of these different places, maybe depending on your income and your kind of personal status. So that's kind of one of the major findings, in a way, of this research. In my view, this kind of emergence of a transcolonial frame of reference for travel. Now, you asked about if there are sort of trend-setting works or kind of groundbreaking works that sort of introduce a new travel destination for the first time, and that then becomes replicated as a model of travel. And indeed, this is very much the case. And indeed, this happens kind of very quickly. So, for example, for Ceylon, which is kind of the first of the places that I'm interested in to become a major travel destination, around sort of the late 1830s, around 1840, the first really sort of popular leisurely travel accounts from Ceylon start to be published in Britain. And there you have, for example, Augustus de Batz writes one of these books in 1841, and he, in his kind of introduction to the book, says, so much has been written about British India as a travel destination, but he says, and I quote, "Strange to say, the beautiful and romantic island of Ceylon has remained in comparative obscurity." So he's very much kind of making a claim on Ceylon as something that hasn't been described before, and he's going to do this now for the first time. Not for the first time, obviously, in reality, but he's kind of telling. And just 24 years later, in 1875, John Thompson writes about Britain's Eastern possessions. He writes completely differently. He says, when he mentions Ceylon, he says, "I need not pause to detail my experiences over one of the beaten tracks of modern tourists." So in those kind of 24 years, Ceylon has become one of the kind of been there, done that tourist places that isn't really interesting anymore. So the process is very quick when something becomes first described in a touristic sense and then becomes kind of over-described to the point that it's no longer interesting for readers. Another example that I have is Charles Kinloch, who was a British official based in Bengal. He wrote about Java and the Straits in a book called De Zieke Reiziger, which is a Dutch name because he was traveling in a Dutch colony. The title means an invalid traveler, so he was on sick leave, basically. So he also, in his introduction to the book, he says that he decided to write the book because at the time there was no guidebook available for travelers who might be interested in this region or in this part of Southeast Asia. And there's a kind of a gap in the market that he wants to fill. And you can kind of see how that then works, because the travel route that he describes through Java in particular is one that many British travelers afterwards follow pretty faithfully. And of course, it isn't solely due to the fact that many of these travelers will have read Kinloch's work. It's also to do with infrastructure. It's also to do with pre-existing Dutch travel habits. But it is, in my opinion, this work by Charles Kinloch that makes that particular travel itinerary a kind of a model for future British travelers on the island. So places that he goes to in terms of the environment, he goes to see, for example, the waterfalls near Bandung. And this becomes a place that almost every British visitor to Java then visits also after him. He goes also near Bandung, he goes to see a particular coffee plantation, which also kind of then becomes a place that is almost like an item on a checklist that, if you go to Central Java, then you just have to see this. So there is this way of kind of reinforcing itineraries or routes, and it happens often in a very short period of time. In about 10 years, someone publishes a book, and then suddenly dozens of other travelers have gone to the same places and written about the same places. Now, you also asked if these travelogues allow us to see how the empire's relationship with or use of the natural environment develops over this period of time. And this is absolutely the case as well. So to take an example from Ceylon, Samuel White Baker, who was a kind of a famous hunter. He wrote kind of hunting accounts and kind of a general adventurer. But from Ceylon in particular, Ceylon was important for sort of hunting tourism. Samuel Baker, in his book 8 Years in Ceylon, 8 Years Wanderings in Ceylon, describes the transformation of the natural environment over the decades that he's known the place. So he says, for example, he says, vast forests in which I formerly hunted elk and boar have now entirely disappeared. And he's talking about how this land is being claimed for agricultural, for coffee plantations, in fact. So I think hunting accounts in particular are a good example of where if you follow accounts from the same place over a few decades, you can see how the natural environment is completely transformed, both by agriculture, by the plantation economy, but also by things like overhunting. Of course, some species become scarce over the 19th century, then become extinct. A tiger on Java, for example, becomes extinct in the 20th century. The tiger disappears from Singapore in the early 20th century. And this is something that you can kind of trace in hunters' accounts, because that's the sort of thing they're interested in. Yeah, I hope that answered most of your question, at least.
Thank you, Dr. Toivanen. I'm going to ask you a few more questions building up on our discussion so far. And let me just go on with the first one. Let me just fire away the first one. You mentioned that certain climates were described in a hierarchical order in terms of their ability to restore one's health. And this sort of is related to a developing sector of health tourism. And in this case, I was just wondering, there's this whole idea of high altitude places in South Asia that should be the place for a sickly man or an ill person to have his health back. I mean, we always hear of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who's traveling to the Valley of Kashmir. Then you have these British officials in the 18th century, and more so in the 19th century when they moved to hill stations during the summer. But you also mentioned about development of specific places, for instance, Kandy and Nuwara Elia in Ceylon, and also in Java, Buitenzorg, Ungarang, and Malang, all of these places. But what I wonder is, how did a specific colonial policy develop these places, or sort of publicize these places as places where you could restore your health, or you could recover from an illness? Were there any specific measures to do that? One of these, of course, you mentioned that this was facilitated by the development of steamship travel, which allowed Singapore to emerge as a destination. But I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how these were publicized. I mean, initially how these were formulated in colonial policies and how these were publicized.
Yeah, thank you. So that's again a very good question. I'd just like to maybe shift the focus a little bit. You asked about how the colonial governments promoted these sites as health resorts. I would perhaps argue that rather than the colonial governments, in this early period of colonial tourism, it's not so much driven by the government. It's more driven by individuals, by popular culture, and by sort of interpersonal connections, informal connections, rather than kind of big state-backed initiatives. And so the period is quite important here. So the kind of tourism that I'm interested in the 19th century, I call it proto-tourism in my research quite often, because it's quite different from our idea of modern sort of 20th century tourism. But it's also important to point out that in the 19th century, people were talking about tourism. This is what people meant by tourism. So the meaning of the word changes. The kind of full-fledged mature tourism that is also backed by government initiatives kind of takes off from the end of the 19th century, from the 1890s, at least in the Dutch East Indies, and kind of becomes more established as a full industry in the early 20th century. But in this kind of proto-tourist stage that I'm interested in, it's really individual enterprise that kind of drives, for example, this resort industry. So, for example, in Nuara Eliya, you can kind of trace there are these sort of several attempts to establish Nuara Eliya as a resort for Europeans. Many of them fail, most of them fail, in fact. And it's often kind of tied in with predictions about how much colonial settlement is there going to be in the next 10 years or in the next 20 years. So there is quite a lively debate around the middle of the 19th century about should we encourage settlers moving into Ceylon or not, and it's kind of tied in with the coffee economy, and it's one of a good example of how tourism is kind of tied into a lot of sort of bigger themes in colonial politics as well. But so it is often individuals or smaller groups, social groups that drive these projects to make some place a resort, for example, and then often they fail, or sometimes they get backing from the state and sometimes they do not. It's also important to note that sometimes it is local rulers like the Sultan of Johor, for example, is known to have at least tried to promote Johor as a kind of a health resort for Singapore-based officials and maybe also officials based in India. So there's quite a wide variety of actors involved in these schemes, but they are primarily not sort of centrally backed from the government. And sometimes when they are, so for example, on Java, the Dutch government does set up resorts, but they are primarily intended for internal use by colonial officials within the colony. So this kind of development of these sites for transcolonial travel and eventually global travel happens precisely through travel writers who write about these places very enthusiastically and kind of give advice for other would-be travelers who can then follow them, like I mentioned with the example of Kinloch. There's also, I think, important to make a distinction between kind of two different spheres within which this sort of promotion happens. So it happens both regionally in Southeast Asia, around the Bay of Bengal, in India, through colonial periodicals. For Southeast Asia in particular, there's the Journal of the Indian Archipelago, which is quite important, where people often write these sort of shorter pieces about a short trip they made somewhere, or some advice on if you're traveling to a place where you should go to a hotel, which volcano should you climb, what sort of equipment should you have if you want to go hiking in the mountains. So there is this kind of local press, which is quite important for spreading the word. Much of it is unfortunately now very difficult to trace because copies have just kind of disappeared for the kind of more short-lived journals. But then apart from that regional market, there's also, of course, these major book form travelogues that I'm also interested in that were quite often published in Europe. And these then take on more a kind of a role as promoting specific colonies as sites of settlement and also for travel. So for Ceylon, which I've mentioned a few times already, a lot of the travel books about Ceylon are very explicitly promoting kind of young British men that they should move to Ceylon and start a plantation, because that's where the future is. Also on a kind of a more sort of aesthetic cultural level, for example, you have a lot of Scottish military officials on Ceylon. They often write about Ceylon. They say, "Oh, this reminds me of the Scottish Highlands, the Ceylon Highlands." So they kind of create this reference frame based on European examples or European kind of models that is then promoting these colonial destinations.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. Toivanen. Might I now just ask you a question about a point that you raised briefly, adventure tourism, or tourism that's centered around volcanoes, scaling of mountains in the colonies. You argue that the colonial travelogues, which spoke about visiting volcanoes or mountains, sort of, give this idea of a primal fear associated with such places, or they portray an exotic kind of picture of these places. But you have spoken quite interestingly about Mount Bromo in eastern Java. And Mount Bromo, as we both know, it was an active volcano in the 19th century. It erupted quite a number of times. And this is a volcano that has been described by anthropologists as a human volcano system where people live very close to the mountain, and their social religious life is associated with an annual festival dedicated to the mountain and worshipping the mountain god. But I also know from my own readings about the Bromo that the mountain Bromo, it caused quite a number of serious environmental crises in the 19th century. Like, it destroyed its eruptions, destroyed crops. Its eruptions were associated with viral fevers that affected the entire surrounding region. And such eruptions would also often force volcanic mountain communities to shift to alternative sources of occupation. But what I wonder is when colonial travelogues encounter such volcanoes that have both this ability to sort of support a local economic system and yet destroy it from time to time, do descriptions of such volcanoes in colonial travelogues somewhat tell us about both the colonial understanding and the colonial inspired popular understanding of such spaces?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. I think the first point to make is that the sort of travel accounts that I researched, sort of popular travel writing, in this sort of writing, you don't really find any sort of deeper engagement with the local conditions or with the local human environment relations in particular, because travelers, by definition, they only stay in a place for a very short time, so they capture a kind of a snapshot rather than an understanding of any longer term developments. And this is particularly true of sort of touristic travel writers who write basically primarily for entertainment, rather than someone like Franz Junghuhn, who's as a kind of a scientist, a geologist, really wants to understand the place in some sort of scientific sense at least, and to get as much detail as he can out of it. So there is this kind of superficiality to travel accounts. Now, Mount Bromo is particularly interesting because it was an active volcano, but it was also a kind of an important cultural site, and it's a site of a kind of a major Hindu festival. Was at the time, still is, I believe. And one travel writer in particular who traveled there in the 19th century, in the 1860s, I think, William Barrington d'Almeida. His travel book, Life in Java, is called, records two separate visits to Mount Bromo on two separate days. And the first of these is very much a kind of a classic volcano account that is inspired by European volcano tourism of the 19th century. So Vesuvius in particular is a kind of an archetype of a volcano as a tourist site in the 19th century, where a lot of Europeans go. And William Barrington d'Almeida writes about his first trip to Mount Bromo, very much using the tropes of Vesuvius tourism from Europe. And there are these sort of scenes of him as a kind of a lonely traveler, and kind of his sort of silent contemplation at the edge of the volcano as this kind of great destructive force. So he's very much playing up this sort of the well-established romantic tropes that derive from Europe at the time. Now, his second visit to Mount Bromo on the next day, I believe, he describes the festival, the Hindu festival. He describes all the kind of exotic details, to his mind, exotic details, all the kind of rituals, He describes all the pilgrims who come to the place, all the colors and sounds of the celebrations. So he's very much depicting, or let's put it like this: his first trip is very much depicting his personal experience of the volcano, and the second trip is very much depicting the local experience of the volcano, or their experience of the volcano. It is kind of this sort of I and them division. And I find it really interesting that he has so kind of clearly separated these two accounts into two different episodes, two different narratives within his larger book. And it seems to suggest to me that European travelers on Java at the time, they understood that there are these different meanings that attach to the volcanoes. There are different cultural significances that attach to the volcanoes, different ways for people to engage with the volcano. But they didn't quite have the tools to really bridge that boundary between different cultural interpretations. They had to kind of silo them off into separate episodes, like William Barrington D'Almeida does. So that, I think, is a good example of how tourists, colonial travelers, try to kind of make sense of these, on the one hand colonial, on the other hand local interpretations of these sites, environmental sites, and the different meanings. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. I will return to a point that you make about a volcano, but another one. But before I do that, I just wonder about the development of modern modes of communication in the 19th century. You have pointed out that steamships often facilitated the development of certain places as health resorts, for instance, Singapore, which you discussed briefly. But you have also tried to speak about the development of telegraphic communication between the Dutch East Indies and Singapore, and how the establishment of the underwater sea cables through the Sunda Straits would often be marked by the coastal ecologies. And especially this happened, as you've pointed out, with the eruption of the Krakatau volcano in 1883, when the entire communication system was destroyed. Did such eruptions, or did such environmental anomalies change, or by any means shift the perception of volcanoes or such places in later accounts, or in later colonial accounts of tourism?
So I should start by saying that my kind of main research on travelogues doesn't really extend to the very end of the 19th century or further. So and to some extent, I'm here on I'm kind of extemporizing a little bit, improvising a little bit. But I think you're right to kind of highlight the importance of the Krakatau eruption in 1883, which is an absolutely kind of a major news event, a major cultural event, both locally as well as globally, and especially in the Netherlands. And other people have written about this. Judith Bosnak and Rick Honings in Leiden, for example, have written about this quite recently, about the kind of the major, about the way that the Krakatau eruption comes to take a major role in Dutch culture in the 1880s and 90s and later. And this is slightly speculative, but I would argue that what the eruption does for Dutch ideas of Javanese volcanoes is it precisely makes them distinct from the European archetype, which is represented by Vesuvius. It gives them a kind of a separate identity because of this massive event that has happened within people's lifetime, so they remember it very clearly. So the Javanese volcanoes become a Krakatau, as a kind of an archetype of that, become a major cultural trope that can now stand independently of Etna, Vesuvius, or Icelandic volcanoes in Europe. So there is that kind of sense in which the imagery changes. And I think this also kind of coincides with what is a wider cultural development towards the end of the 19th century in Europe, towards Orientalism and this kind of exotica of tropical islands in particular, which is imagery that is very much used in the promotion of tourism, early tourism, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So I think obviously the crocodile eruption does not on its own cause that cultural shift, but it very much interacts with that wider cultural shift to create this sort of imagery with which Java in particular comes to be sold to tourists as a desirable destination, a possibly dangerous destination, but dangerous in a sense that makes it more exciting. There's something that you can kind of sell. You can make pictures of it that are exciting to watch, to view. So yeah, there is this. It does kind of change the language of travel, I think. That's about as much as I can say about that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a final question before we call it a day. Do you think that colonial redesigning of natural environment in the 19th century in Ceylon, in Singapore, in Java, and how these areas were portrayed in the colonial travel literature of the 19th century still sort of shapes some of the modern understanding of these places? Would you like to reflect on that?
Well, to some extent, I'm a little bit reluctant to answer that question because I know very much the 19th century history of this tourism, and then I've been to some of these places in the 21st century. But there is quite a lot that happened over the 20th century that I'm not really an expert on. And I think it's very important to consider 20th century, what happens over the 20th century, because it's kind of crucial importance for questions of agency and control, especially questions of how do post-independence regimes kind of take over from colonial regimes. How do they transform these sorts of natural sites, travel destinations? What happens in that kind of point of inflection? So I don't want to address that question too much because there are people who are better placed to do so than I am. But of course, it's a kind of fairly simple observation that many of the major sites of 19th century colonial tourism remain tourist destinations today. This is notably true of the botanical gardens, which, you know, the Singapore botanical gardens are one of the major kind of tourist sites in Singapore at the moment. Same goes for Batu on Java. So these are kind of big draws for global tourism in the present day as well. There are also sites like on Penang Island, you have Penang Hill or the waterfalls, which are very much kind of packaged as places to see if you go to Malaysia. And this has, you know, been the case since the 19th century. The infrastructure that has developed around those sites, it's not the same infrastructure as in the 19th century, but it has very much kind of been built on top of older colonial infrastructure layer by layer. So there is that kind of gradual development. I think an important point to make as well is that nowadays environment tourism and colonial tourism, oh sorry, let me put that a different way. Nowadays it's both the environment and the colonialism of the colonial history that are packaged as products for tourists. So for example, if you go to the Singapore Botanical Gardens and you're enjoying the natural beauty of the place, but you're also enjoying the narrative of colonial history that is being presented to you in that place. And then afterwards, maybe you go to the Raffles Hotel in Singapore for the night, and that's very much you're being sold this tourist experience of colonialism as heritage, nature as heritage. So these things are intertwined. I think that's important to keep in mind. But I think maybe the point that I kind of want to finish on is to say, in terms of the natural environment and tourism in this region, the major form of global tourism in this region now is probably kind of beach tourism on Bali or in Thailand, various places. That's obviously a tourism for which the environment is of crucial importance, but it is a form of tourism that does not really have a 19th century precedent. This is very much a 20th century invention. So the product that you're being sold now, if you go to Thailand on a beach holiday, is of a much more recent creation than the kinds of tourism that I'm looking at in my research. But of course, the industry, the beach industry, the whatever you call it, it's very much built on global economic relations, Western cultural models that are rooted in colonialism, in kind of colonial period discourses. And the kind of the underpinning idea of exploiting nature for leisure does, in my opinion, derive from the same sort of colonial extractive mindset that is also apparent in the sources that I've looked at in the 19th century. So I'm not an expert on beaches, either as a researcher or as an individual in my personal life, but I think they do reflect the same colonial history that I've been looking at in the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Toivanen. It was a wonderful podcast, I hope. Our listeners have learned a lot today. Our podcasts have usually looked at how we can read colonial archives to understand histories of climatic anomalies or developmental policies of urban and rural areas of GIS, but we have also looked at medicinal development of medicinal knowledge in the colonial period, but probably this is the first time that we listen to somebody speaking about how colonial tourism can also help us understand human-environment interaction in the 19th century. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. My name is Archish Man, and you have been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast. Thank you very much.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.